But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if God wanted something better for your life? What if God could take our lives and not just settle for less, settle for good enough, and give us something great and something beyond our measure? Thank you guys for coming to church and starting off this new, happy new year, and welcome to what God has for us this year. And before we kind of dive into this new series and the book we're going to be kind of diving through today, I just want to take a little second and just kind of celebrate and recognize some of what's happened the last few weeks. We were not here last Sunday. We have our annual one Sunday, not in person. You sit on your couch and you watch church. Some people do that more than annually, but unless you're sick, we encourage you to come here, right? But we didn't meet in person, but we had our unplugged service, and it was great to just see kind of those people across online. But 2 weeks ago, it feels a lot longer than that, but Christmas Eve was only 2 weeks ago, I promise. And some of you that still have Christmas lights, put those things away, because Christmas was 2 weeks ago, okay? We done with that. But 2 weeks ago, we had our Christmas Eve services, and we had the highest attendance we have ever had on Christmas Eve here at Cross Church, okay? And that was not just true for us here at our Phoenix campus, that was true across all our campuses. So it's just amazing to see what God continues to do. We had our very first preview service at El Mirage that we'll be launching later this month. We'll be talking about in the coming weeks. So just be praying, be thanking God for what he's doing across Cross Church. And man, we're just excited for what this next year brings. And as we say that, what does God kind of have in store for us in 2024 in this new year? And as we start a new year, I hope that's a question that you are asking yourself. Because really, this is what this series that we're going to begin this year is all about, is what does God have for you? Because you've probably tried a lot of other things that our world has to offer. You've probably gone, and this is the time of year where we make resolutions. And resolutions, they should be like, I don't know if the definition of that, it's probably like weekly held promises or aspirations, right? You're like, this year, I'm going to get fit. This year, I'm not going to be so much in debt. This year, all of a sudden, I'm going to love my family more. This year, I'm going to show up to church and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. We make all these great things and all these great plans and all these goals, which are good goals to make. But time starts to pass, and all of a sudden, those resolutions, one by one, start to drop. And here's the issue with that is a lot of time we have a goal, we have a vision, we have an idea of what we want to achieve in this next year. But then as time passes, we might have a goal, but we don't have a plan. And all of a sudden what results is nothing. Instead of all of a sudden you doing that exercise routine, or you starting to pick up books to read, or you start going to church, or you start being financially healthy or food healthy. Instead, it just kind of results in nothing. And that's not really by accident. If you actually kind of dig into this further, here's what we kind of fall into two traps is one, we have this goal, we have this vision of what we have, but then we don't really have a plan. And at the end of the day, what that equals is nothing happens. Or maybe you're the opposite. You don't really have a goal or a vision or a plan of or a goal or a vision of where you're going, but you have a plan of how to get there. But you know what that results in? It usually results in nothing too, because you have no idea when you're done. In both of us, if we're honest, in some way, you have probably fallen into this trap. You have probably seen new year after new year of having these ideas of some area of your life you want to take a step forward in, but you just fail constantly and fall short more often than not. But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if God wanted something better for your life? What if God could take our lives and not just settle for less, settle for good enough, and give us something great and something beyond our measure? Because here's the deal. Sometimes we kind of fall in this little middle ground, and you're like, you know what? I might have failed at my resolutions time after time, but I'm at a place in my life where I'm just content. That's a good word, actually, right? To be content with my situation. But let me tell you, there's a fine line between contentment and being negligent with what God has given you. In 1 Timothy 6:6, it says, godliness with contentment is great gain, right? It's good to be content with what we have and not just always miserable and wanting more and more and more. But you have to read that in light of other verses like Philippians 3:14 that says, I pursue as my goal the prize promised by God's heavenly call in Christ Jesus. We pursue goals in our lives. We reach for something more and we say, you know what, good enough isn't necessarily good enough, but God can do more. Today, as we start this series, Crossing Rivers, you see we come to these people in Israel who were at a very similar crossroads in their life. That they were standing on this vision in front of them of what God says, I'm going to give you this land that's better than you can ever imagine. And I'm going to give you this leader named Joshua, and he's going to take you into this land. But in Joshua chapter 1, verse 2, it tells Joshua exactly what they had to do to get there. And it says this, now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I am giving the Israelites. Here's what Joshua had to do in order to achieve what God had given him. There was this giant river standing in his way. And often when we have places to go and we have goals to reach and we have things that God has shown us that we are strive for, there's usually something in the way of reaching it. And it was no different for Joshua. This wasn't like a stream. This wasn't just like, hey, I skip a few rocks and I can find where not to fall in and then I'm good and I'm across the river. This was the Jordan River. It was kind of a big deal. Like if you cross the Colorado River, not like when it's in a drought and we, can cross and it's like an Arizona river where it's all just like dry and you just hope water doesn't come and drown you. But like if you cross a real Colorado River where it's flowing, that thing ain't easy to go across. And even if you're a good swimmer, you're probably not making it, and you're really not taking hundreds of thousands of people with women and children along with you. Instead, God has to miraculously show them how they're going to do it. And here comes our challenge that we're going to dive into in this series and continue to talk about is we all have rivers in our lives that separate the good enough from the God-given stuff. If you're honest with yourself, there's probably some ways in your life where you have living with the good enough. That you have the good enough in your life, but you need to move on to the God-given stuff that he has for you. That river might be hard to cross, that it might be rough to go down this way, but God has something in store for you. God has something better for you that is beyond your imagination. And if we're honest, the good enough, sometimes, here's what I found, it's not even that good, it's just easy. You don't even really like in some of the areas your life is at, but it's easier to just accept it and settle for it rather than doing the hard work of striving for something more. It's not hard to change. I mean, it is hard to change. It's not hard to stay the same. It's not hard to just do nothing. It's hard to do the work of diving into what our issues are and saying, how can we get out of it and how can we move forward? And today, as we dive into this, we're going to see is what would it be like if we truly captured the vision that God has for our life? What would it truly look like if we bought into the plan that God has laid out for us? What would our health and our fitness and our finances and our families and our faith look like if we truly sold out for him? Well, the question we probably need to ask in order to get there is, well, how do we get there in the first place? Is how do we cross the rivers of our lives? Well, if you haven't already, go ahead and flip to Joshua chapter 1. And we're going to be starting in Joshua 1 in verse 1, in chapter 1, verse 1. And if you are flipping there, this is the sixth book of the Bible. It's right after the first five that are there. And here, just a little bit background as we kind of go to jump into this. Let me kind of catch you up on what Israel, this nation we're kind of following, what they have done to this point. And we're going to see as we dive into their story is how they kind of practically move to cross these rivers, this river that they encountered, and how we can do it as well. But you see, Israel, if you kind of go back a little bit of time, they were a nation, hundreds of thousands of people that were enslaved in Egypt. And for years after years, for decades after decades, they were stuck here. They were living miserable lives so far from what God had intended for them. And finally, he raised up this man named Moses And Moses, the old story that if you've been in church, if you haven't been in church, you've probably heard like, Moses, Moses, whoa, whoa, let my people go, or Pharaoh, Pharaoh, right? Moses goes to Pharaoh and tells like, hey, I want my people out. And God is working through him, and Pharaoh refuses, but these miracles happen, and finally all the people come out of Egypt. They cross a sea that God dries up, and they end up in the wilderness. And before long, they're wandering around in this wilderness. God's giving them rules to keep. He gave them the 10 Commandments. We actually studied a series last year about that. He's giving them all these rules and regulations of how to live their lives, how to run their nation, and they're constantly falling short and messing up. So finally, God's like, I'm just going to let you guys all stay in this wilderness until all you die off, and I'm going to let your kids realize the promise I gave for them. And in that, Joshua is this leader to lead this next generation of people. And right as we start the book of Joshua, they're standing really on the doorstep of this promised land. And as God is preparing them for what they will face when they get into this promised land, the first thing God kind of challenges them and challenges us today that we need to do in order to cross these rivers of our lives is we need to understand the past. Check out Joshua chapter 1, starting in verse 1. It says this, that after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, and he said this, that Moses, my servant, is dead. Now we're going to stop right there because I think there's a lot of weight we need to just kind of unpack here. Is Joshua, he is taking over for his friend, his mentor, the greatest leader Israel has ever known in this man of Moses. And not only is he taking over for him, but God says something there pretty important. He says, Moses is dead. So it's not like sometimes you take over for someone at work or you're in a new position and you can kind of call the old guy and be like, hey, I'm running into this problem. Like, what would you do in this situation? How did this go? Like, Moses is dead, okay? They didn't have cell phones, and they really don't have cell phones that can call heaven, okay, at this time. So he's on his own. Joshua is taking over for this guy, but he can't even contact him anymore. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it seems like out of nowhere, but there's been time building to this, that Joshua is the old wise guy in the room. Isn't that scary? As you age and as you become an adult, eventually you become the older wise guy in the room. And the more you surround yourself by people you're mentoring and pouring into, you're going to quickly become the old wise guy in the room. I got a haircut yesterday because I need to get the sides short because my gray's coming in. And even though I'm still in my 30s, I'm looking more like an old wise guy or a dumb wise guy. I don't know, whatever. An old dumb guy, that's what it is. All right. But it's like all of a sudden Joshua is that leader. Moses is gone. But here, put your shoes even more so in Joshua's standpoint a little bit here. He's taking over for a guy who led thousands of people out of slavery, hundreds of thousands of people. He's taking over for a guy that literally spoke face to face with God. Try filling those shoes. He's taking over for the guy who was given the 10 Commandments by God. He was taking over for a guy that wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And it's like, Joshua, you're next up in line. Be like, yeah, I'm going to pass on that one. Let's let another guy go first, him fail miserably, and I'll take over for that guy, okay? But I don't want to take over for Moses at this moment. And he is this is a big deal that he has to do. But here's a few things we should know about Joshua and why he was exactly the man for this. First, Joshua is one of 2 people left alive that knew what slavery was like in Egypt. Him and Caleb are the only 2 left. God let everyone else die off because they weren't faithful enough. But him and Joshua, they understood. Caleb and Joshua, they knew what it was like in Egypt. They also scouted the promised land 40 years before this. They had seen the vision that God had for them, but they had to wait for 40 years before it would ultimately be realized. And he was patiently waiting for this day. But he also had a great handoff from his mentor in Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 9, it says, Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. You see, Joshua, He's going into the biggest moment of his life. He knew the trials of his past. He knew the patience of waiting for the right moment. He knew the frustration of watching Moses deal with stupid people time after time after time, and it all prepared him to face this challenge. Here's a little key thought, I think, for us to apply in this to our lives today is if you don't know where you've been, you can't know where you're going. If you don't know where you've been, you can't know where you're going. You need to understand your past and understand the past of what has happened to be able to pave that way forward. When I got my first real job in the world, graduated from ASU, and I had done an internship and had this job waiting for me where I was going to be an HR manager at Target. And the first thing, and I had a lot of great coaching and a lot of great people and leaders around me to help, but the first thing I needed to figure out is what was the last guy like? What were his strengths? What were his weaknesses? I was lucky he had a lot of weaknesses, I'm not gonna lie. So it kind of helped. It's like, okay, I can do that. But it's like, what do I need to focus on? What do I need to not focus on? What has this team been through? What is this culture like? I need to know all that stuff to then walk into that situation and be effective. When we started here at Cross Church Phoenix, the first thing that we knew that was really easy to know is we started here, we were the 6th church in 5 years. So what success looked like is stay open 2 years, okay? Fast forward to 2024, this is going to be our 8th year in this building. Ooh. But you see, when you know the past, when you know where you've been, where you know where the situation has been, you can start to understand and pave the way forward of where we need to go. And you see, when we understand our past and when this becomes personal, this is the hard part, when we understand our struggles, when we understand our addictions, when we understand our shortcomings and our failures, we can also understand better our strengths and in our successes. And what God does that is he takes that and he lets that be part of our character and build us towards the future. And here's the fact, when we start to understand the past, what's so awesome about this is then we get to understand our task. Let's keep reading. In verse 2, he tells him, Moses, my servant, is dead. But then he continues on. He says, now get all the people, hundreds of thousands of people. And he says, prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I'm giving the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will be from the wilderness and Lebanon to the great river, the Euphrates, and all the land of the Hittites, and west to the Mediterranean Sea. You see, as God moves into and talking to Joshua here and giving him kind of this path forward, he was crystal clear on what the task that Joshua had on hand. He says it real easy and clear here in these first couple of verses. He tells him to cross the river. He tells him to take the land, and then he says, here are the boundaries of the land that you're going to take, right? He doesn't kind of make this muddy and complicated. He says, hey, just go into the promised land and you'll figure it out. No, he says, go over there, take the land. Taking the land means killing a lot of people. We won't quite get into all that in this series, but read through the book of Joshua. It's a little gory and bloody. It's awesome. But he's like, take the land, and then here's kind of the boundaries, and this is the land I prepared for you and promised you. And Joshua knew that this wasn't going to be an easy task. It was actually going to be harder as soon as he crossed the river than actually crossing the river itself. But it was one that was crystal clear. And I think today we have a problem in our world where often we lack clarity on what we need to do and where we're going forward. You know, as I was thinking about this and kind of doing some research, I'm like, kind of what led to this? And there's a lot of factors that go into this. But one of the things I thought about is you look at our world today, and we live in, really honest, ever since, I'm going to give you a little history lesson, the industrial age, it's kind of changed how people work. Right? You used to have a trade, you used to go work on the farm, you did this, and you like understood, you take care of the animals, and you knew like I was raising this animal, one day we're gonna eat this animal, and I'm gonna see the whole process, right? Instead, now we're in industrial age, so you go into a factory or something and you're like hitting a button. You're like, I don't even know what this is doing, but my job, I was told to hit this button. How it contributes to anything else, I don't care, but I get paid to touch this button at this time, and if something goes wrong, I hit that button, and that's all I need to know. But you see, the problem is, not only have we done that sometimes in the workforce, sometimes we've done that in our personal lives. is we become grown-up adults who don't know what we're supposed to be doing, who don't know what our larger places in society, in our families. And I'm speaking from experiences. We have a lot of grown-up children, and I can be sometimes the frontmost of that. And then I look at people who are more grown-up children. It makes me feel better about myself, all right? I'll confess my sin there. But here's the issue, is we can fall into this trap where culturally is we have this problem where people just don't know how to grow up. And people don't know what they're supposed to do in their life. It used to be crystal clear. And you go kind of all the way back to history, and in the Bible times we saw this, God says, go and be fruitful and multiply. It used to be you go get married, you have babies, and you contribute to society. Now, I have no idea what those three things are. Now we don't know what it looks like anymore. And there's a lack of clarity on where God is leading us sometimes and where God is taking us. And we live these lives where we don't know what we're supposed to do. And here's the issue when we talk about this, and kind of our key thought in here when we say we need to understand our task is if you don't know what you are doing, you can't know when you are done. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know if you're winning, and you don't know if you've completed the task. And that is a hard thing to come to terms with as an adult, right? It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. If you don't know that question, then we have no idea where we're headed and what completion looks like. Here, for me, as I'm praying about this and reflecting on it, I was like, okay, so what does this look in my personal life? Let me just give you an example as your pastor. And if this is your church family, then I'm your pastor. If you're visiting, then I'm just some dude on stage that's just talking away, and maybe I'll be your pastor one day, or you'll think I'm dumb and don't know anything. You can take it either way. But as your pastor, there are three things that I think I'm responsible for doing. The first one is to preach God's word. And that's where it starts. If I get away from this book, if I start preaching something besides this book, then I get fired by our elder board and I get shipped away, right? And then I go find a new hobby. But my first instinct, my first job, my task is to preach God's word. The second thing I'm called to do as a pastor is to develop believers. No matter where you are in your journey, if you do not know Jesus yet, I want to introduce you to Jesus. So you know Jesus, I want to know what it looks like to get to know him better. If you are starting to lead something, how can you lead it even more effectively and more Jesus-like? Is how do we see that development happen? And the third thing is to engage my city. Is to show the city around me that I love them, that Jesus loves them, that I care about them, and I want them to know who this Jesus is that can change something that no one else can. But here's the deal. I believe firmly that if I preach God's word, that if I develop believers in my life, and if I engage my city, my end goal is I think that I will go to heaven one day and God will say, well done, good and faithful servant. That is my task. I am clear about it. I know, but let me tell you, that doesn't make it easy. I fail on the regular. There are times when those things, even though they are so clear, that maybe at times they might become muddy, or maybe my energy isn't right there to match it, that I get lazy, that I get distracted, that I get bogged down in my sin. And for all of us, it's this constant reminder, like Joshua, of God has made it clear. So we should not mess this up and we should not get distracted, but we almost need to go back to the basics and the clarity of what God has for us. And here's the encouraging part about that, because just because a task is clear doesn't mean you have the power or the ability to do it. Because oftentimes when you rely on your own power, when you rely on your own strength, you will fail. But that's why it is so important. In this third point we see of that what God kind of gives to Joshua is not only that we know the past, we understand the task, but that we also understand what lasts. Check out verse 5 here. And he says this, that no one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. For this is God talking. He says, I will be with you. Just as I was with Moses, I will not leave you or abandon you. You see, God tells Joshua that this amazing journey, this task, this goal, this vision that God has for his life, he tells him right off the bat, he says, this won't be short-lived. He said, this is like, you're going to not take the promised land. It's going to be a month in, and then all of a sudden another enemy is going to come and take you away. He tells Joshua right off the bat that this is going to endure throughout your entire lifetime. He says, I'm going to give you something that lasts. But even more important, God tells Joshua why it will last. He says, because my presence will be with you. God's like, the reason this is going to happen, the reason this is going to continue is because God says, I will be with you. Over the holidays, it felt like a really long couple weeks since we've been here. I know it's been 2 weeks. It felt like a month. But I got to talk to some church family members and see some people and text back and forth with people. And one of my favorite things I got over this holiday season is there's a guy I've been talking with who's been struggling the last couple months and kind of had some rough patches. But he sent me this text. And there's just so much wisdom in here. And here's what he said to me. He says, what I'm figuring out is how badly I need God's protection, how I need to trust in him more. And here's what he's saying is I figured out that I've tried to do so many things on my own strength, but what I really need is God's presence to be with me. And here's the thing, the world will offer us gimmicks. They'll offer us quick fixes. They'll say, do this, go on this diet, try this workout routine, take this supplement, do this, do that, and all of a sudden your life will fall into place. The problem is it falls into place and it falls out of place just as quickly. What we need to endure, to last, is God's presence to enter that situation. God's presence to be there, to figure out what it is we are missing inside. Take this a little bit more example and make this practical in our lives. As you think of a kind of issues or, habits that we try to break and we try to become released from. I think of, for example, is like things like alcoholism. And we talk about this in CR that so many people struggle with. And one of the first step that's easy to say is I'm going to stop drinking. That's a great first step, okay? And that's something you should try. But here's the problem is stop drinking is only step one in fixing the issue. After you get sober, the next harder step is why was I drinking in the first place? And what was that drinking trying to mask inside my life? Well, those aren't the questions you like to answer because then it gets real uncomfortable. And you see, that's the hard work of sustainability in our lives. And that's what God starts to do when we let him be present and enter the situation. He says, no, you're not defined by that. That is just a coping mechanism because you have a loneliness, you have a burden, you have something in your heart that is not complete that only God can fill. And you see here, Joshua gets the assurance of his success because God tells him he's going to be the one there. He's going to sustain the victory no matter what happened. And here, I believe, is a key thought for us that we can divide and we can kind of pull out of this is if you don't know if it's sustainable, you can't know whether it will be successful. You see, Joshua knew that God's presence would be with him so that when he crossed that river and the work got even harder than it was before, that he was going to be able to sustain the success because God guaranteed it. You see, too often we fail at things because we try to do things that frankly are not possible with where we're currently at. The New Year's resolutions I love that I've been so dumb to make in the past is like, you know what? This year, I think I need to start getting it in shape. And even though I haven't done any running for the last year, I'm going to start running 5 miles a day. Get off the couch and go run 5 miles. See when you fall down in the middle of it and need oxygen and need to go get picked up because you can't run that far, right? You can't go from 0 to 5 miles and all of a sudden you're good. Or it's okay, maybe you're the fitness thing, that doesn't sound so good. Maybe I want to read and be more educated. I'm going to read for 3 hours a day. You're going to fall asleep in 30 minutes, all right? Or maybe it's a little different. Maybe you're I'm going to read my Bible, okay? I'm going to read my Bible for an hour a day. Yeah, it's probably not going to happen that quick. Or, hey, maybe it's I'm going to write. I'm going to start journaling. And I'm going to write for an hour a day, and all of a sudden your hand starts hurting 5 minutes in. Or maybe it's a little different. You're hey, it's maybe I'm going to just start praying. And I'm going to pray for 30 minutes a day. And all of a sudden you're falling asleep 5 minutes in. Here's the issue is we try to take on more than what we can truly achieve. But when we start small Hey, maybe I'm going to walk for a mile first. Hey, maybe I'm going to read for about 30 minutes. Hey, maybe I'm going to do this, and I'm going to start small, and I'm going to work my way, but then I'm going to watch God enter into the picture. I'm going to watch God empower me. I'm going to watch God's presence be with me. And all of a sudden, that success that I just couldn't seem to sustain, God will start to shape and change and pull away the layers to form us into the people he wants us to be. The people who are capable, the people who are surrendered, and the people who are ready to cross the rivers, to move from what is just simply good enough to what God has really given us. This year, as we dive into this, and as we kind of move into this plan, what we're going to see is that Joshua was a man who could do all this. He was the leader for the day because he was the leader, as verse 5 says, the one that God was with. We just got done celebrating in the Christmas season that Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, has come down here for us. And you see, as we continue that into this new year, here's what I want you to hear, and here's what I want you to understand, that there are so many practical steps as we've talked about how we can apply, how we can strengthen, how we can make sure we are ready to cross that river, that none of it matters if God isn't with you. That none of it matters is if you haven't surrendered yourself to the Savior of the world who came here to live for you, to die for you, to forgive you so you could know a better life. My prayer in this coming season is that we can start searching our hearts. We can start reflecting on the shortcomings, on the challenges, on the places we have failed, and we can ask God to enter into them. And we can start moving from just tolerating what is good enough to truly living in the God-given stuff that he has for our lives. Are you ready to cross the rivers of your difficulty? Are you ready to see what God has for you in 2024?